Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Emma by Jane Austen. In the last part, we discovered that a letter had been sent to Mrs. Weston by Frank Churchill, explaining some of his more mysterious conduct. A letter which Emma found quite satisfactory, but upon showing it to Mr. Knightley, he was a little more sceptical, shall we say, of the true goodness of the intentions of Frank Churchill. At any rate, it seems that whatever mysteries of his behaviour or of the relationship between himself and Miss Jane Fairfax existed have been solved. And it is with that knowledge, as well as the knowledge that Mr. Knightley has kindly consented to abide with the Woodhouses, as opposed to insisting that Emma remove herself to Donwell Abbey, upon their marriage, an arrangement, I should more correctly say, which will provide the greatest pleasure and joy to Mr. Woodhouse, who would be dismayed either through a change of scenery or from the absence of his daughter. So it is with those two revelations that we begin this penultimate part, for indeed it will be next time on Soft Stories that we finish Emma. Very exciting. Today we begin Chapter 52. It was a very great relief to Emma to find Harriet as desirous as herself to avoid a meeting. I should mention, for those of you who do not recall, that the last chapter ended with a brief reflection by Emma on how Harriet would receive the news of Emma and Mr. Knightley forming a union, when the former lady, Miss Harriet Smith, has already professed to Emma that she loves Mr. Knightley. Their intercourse was painful enough by letter. How much worse had they been obliged to meet? Harriet herself expressed herself very much as might be supposed, without reproaches or apparent sense of ill usage. And yet, Emma fancied, there was a something of resentment, a something bordering on it in her style, which increased the desirableness of their being separate. It might only be her own consciousness, but it seemed as if an angel only could have been quite without resentment under such a stroke. She had no difficulty in procuring Isabella's invitation, and she was fortunate in having a sufficient reason for asking it without resorting to invention. There was a tooth amiss. Harriet really wished, and had wished some time, to consult a dentist. Mrs. John Knightley was delighted to be of use, and anything of ill health was a recommendation to her. And though not so fond of a dentist as of Mr. Wingfield, she was quite eager to have Harriet under her care. And it was thus settled on her sister's side. Emma proposed it to her friend, and found her very persuadable. Harriet was to go. She was invited for at least a fortnight. She was to be conveyed in Mr. Woodhouse's carriage. It was all arranged, it was all completed, and Harriet was safe in Brunswick Square. Now Emma could, indeed, enjoy Mr. Knightley's visits. Now she could talk, and she could listen with true happiness, unchecked by that sense of injustice, of guilt, of something most painful, which had haunted her when remembering how disappointed a heart was near her. How much might, at that moment, and at a little distance, be enduring by the feelings which she had led astray herself. The difference of Harriet at Mrs. Goddard's, or in London, made perhaps an unreasonable difference in Emma's sensations. I was just thinking the same thing. But she could not think of her in London without objects of curiosity and employment, which must be averting the past and carrying her out of herself. She would not allow any other anxiety to succeed directly to the place in her mind which Harriet had occupied. There was a communication before her, one which she only could be competent to make, the confession of her engagement to her father. But she would have nothing to do with it at present. She had resolved to defer the disclosure till Mrs. Weston was safe and well. No additional agitation should be thrown at this period among those she loved, and the evil should not act on herself by anticipation before the appointed time. A fortnight, at least, of leisure and peace of mind to crown every warmer but more agitating delight should be hers. She soon resolved, equally as a duty and a pleasure, to employ half an hour of this holiday of spirits in calling on Miss Fairfax. She ought to go, and she was longing to see her, the resemblance of their present situations increasing every other motive of goodwill. It would be a secret satisfaction, but the consciousness of a similarity of prospect would certainly add to the interest with which she should attend to anything Jane might communicate. She went. She had been driven once unsuccessfully to the door, but had not been into the house since the morning after Box Hill, when poor Jane had been in such distress as had filled her with compassion, though all the worst of her sufferings had been unsuspected. The fear of being still unwelcome determined her, though assured of their being at home, to wait in the passage, and send up her name. She heard Patty announcing it, but no such bustle succeeded as poor Miss Bates had before made so happily intelligible. No, she heard nothing but the instant reply of "Beg her to walk up," and a moment afterwards she was met on the stairs by Jane herself, coming eagerly forward, as if no other reception of her were felt sufficient. Emma had never seen her look so well, so lovely, so engaging. There was consciousness, animation, and warmth. There was everything which her countenance or manner could ever have wanted. She came forward and offered a hand. She said, in a low but very feeling tone, "This is most kind indeed. Miss Woodhouse, it is impossible for me to express. I hope you will believe. Excuse me for being entirely without words." Emma was gratified and would soon have shown no want of words if the sound of Mrs. Elton's voice from the sitting-room had not checked her, and made it expedient to compress all her friendly and all her congratulatory sensations into a very, very earnest shake of the hand. Mrs. Bates and Mrs. Elton were together. Miss Bates was out, which accounted for the previous tranquillity. Emma could have wished Mrs. Elton elsewhere, but she was in a humour to have patience with everybody, and as Mrs. Elton met her with unusual graciousness, she hoped the raconteur would do them no harm. She soon believed herself to penetrate Mrs. Elton's thoughts, and understand why she was, like herself, in happy spirits. It was being in Miss Fairfax's confidence, and fancying herself acquainted with what was still a secret to other people. Emma saw symptoms of it immediately, in the expression of her face, and while paying her own compliments to Mrs. Bates, and appearing to attend to the good old lady's replies, she saw her, with a sort of anxious parade of mystery, fold up a letter which she had apparently been reading aloud to Miss Fairfax, and return it into the purple and gold reticule by her side, saying, with significant nods, "We can finish this some other time, you know. You and I shall not want opportunities. And, in fact, you have heard all the essential already. I only wanted to prove to you that Mrs. S. admits our apology and is not offended. You see how delightfully she writes. Oh, she is a sweet creature. You would have doted on her had you gone. But not a word more. Let us be discreet, quite on our good behaviour. Hush. You remember those lines? I forget the poem at this moment. For when the lady's in the case, you know all other things give place. Now, I say, my dear, in our case, for lady read, Mum, a word to the wise. I'm in a fine flow of spirits, aren't I? But I want to set your heart at ease as to Mrs. S. My representation, you see, has quite appeased her. And again, on Emma's merely turning her head to look at Mrs. Bates's knitting, she added, in a half-whisper, I mention no names, you will observe. Oh, no. Cautious as a minister of state. I managed it extremely well. Emma could not doubt. It was a palpable display, repeated on every possible occasion. When they had all talked a little while in harmony of the weather and Mrs. Weston, she found herself abruptly addressed with, Do you not think, Miss Woodhouse, our saucy little friend here is charmingly recovered? Do you not think her cure does Perry the highest credit? Here was a side glance of great meaning at Jane. Upon my word, Perry has restored her in a wonderful short time. Oh, if you had seen her as I did when she was at the worst. And when Mrs. Bates was saying something to Emma, whispered farther, We do not say a word of any assistance that Perry might have. Not a word of a certain young physician from Windsor. Oh, no, Perry shall have all the credit. I have scarce had the pleasure of seeing you, Miss Woodhouse, she shortly afterwards began, since the party to Box Hill. Very pleasant party, but yet I think there was something wanting. Things did not seem... That is, there seemed a little cloud upon the spirits of some. So it appeared to me, at least, but I might be mistaken. However, I think it answered so far as to tempt one to go again. What say you both to our collecting the same party and exploring to Box Hill again while the fine weather lasts? It must be the same party, you know, quite the same party. not one exception. Soon after this, Miss Bates came in, and Emma could not help being diverted by the perplexity of her first answer to herself, resulting, she supposed, from doubt of what might be said, and an impatience to say everything. "Ah, thank you, dear Miss Woodhouse, you are all kindness. It's impossible to say. Yes, indeed, I quite understand dearest Jane's prospects. That is, I do not mean... but she is charmingly recovered. How is Mr. Woodhouse? Oh, I'm so glad. Quite out of my power. Such a happy little circle as you find us here. Yes, indeed. Charming young man. That is, so very friendly. Oh, I mean, good Mr. Perry. Such attention to Jane. And from her more than commonly thankful delight towards Mrs. Elton for being here, Emma guessed that there had been a little show of resentment towards Jane from the vicarage quarter, which was now graciously overcome. After a few whispers, indeed, which placed it beyond a guess, Mrs. Elton, speaking louder, said, "Yes, here I am, my good friend, and here I have been so long that anywhere else I should think it necessary to apologize, but the truth is that I am waiting for my lord and master. He promised to join me here and pay his respects to you." "What? Are we to have the pleasure of a call from Mr. Elton? That will be a favour indeed, for I know gentlemen do not like morning visits, and Mr. Elton's time is so engaged." "Upon my word it is, Miss Bates. He really is engaged from morning to night. There is no end of people's coming to him on some pretence or other. The magistrates and overseers and churchwardens are always wanting his opinion. They seem not to be able to do anything without him. Upon my word, Mr. E., I often say, rather you than I. I do not know what would become of my crayons and my instrument if I had half so many applicants. Bad enough as it is, for I absolutely neglect them both to an unpardonable degree. I believe I have not played a bar this fortnight. However, he is coming, I assure you. Yes, indeed, on purpose to wait on you all." And putting up her hand to screen her words from Emma, "A congratulatory visit, you know. Oh, yes, quite indispensable." Miss Bates looked about her so happily. "He promised to come to me as soon as he could disengage himself from Knightley, but he and Knightley are shut up together in deep consultation. Mr. E. is Knightley's right hand." Emma would not have smiled for the world, and only said, "Is Mr. Elton gone on foot to Donwell? He will have a hot walk." "Oh, no. It's a meeting at the Crown, a regular meeting. Weston and Cole will be there too, but one is apt to speak only of those who lead. I fancy Mr. E. and Knightley have everything their own way." "Have you not mistaken the day?" said Emma. "I am almost certain that the meeting at the Crown is not till tomorrow. Mr. Knightley was at Hartfield yesterday, and spoke of it as for Saturday." "Oh, no, the meeting is certainly today," was the abrupt answer, which denoted the impossibility of any blunder on Mrs. Elton's side. "I do believe," she continued, "that this is the most troublesome parish that ever was. You never heard of such things at Maple Grove." "Your parish there was small," said Jane. "Upon my word, my dear, I do not know, for I never heard the subject talked of." "But it is proved by the smallness of the school, which I have heard you speak of, as under the patronage of your sister and Mrs. Braggie, the only school, and not more than 25 children." "You clever creature, that's very true. What a thinking brain you have. I say, Jane, what a perfect character you and I should make if we could be shaken together. My liveliness and your solidity would produce perfection. Not that I presume to insinuate, however, that some people may not think you perfection already. But hush, not a word, if you please. It seemed an unnecessary caution. Jane was wanting to give her words, not to Mrs. Elton, but to Miss Woodhouse, as the latter plainly saw. The wish of distinguishing her, as far as civility permitted, was very evident, though it could not often proceed beyond a look. Mr. Elton made his appearance. His lady greeted him with some of her sparkling vivacity. "Very pretty, sir, upon my word, to send me on here to be an encumbrance to my friends so long before you vouchsafed to come. But you knew what a dutiful creature you had to deal with. You knew I should not stir till my lord and master appeared. Here have I been sitting this hour, giving these young ladies a sample of true conjugal obedience. For who can say, you know, how soon it may be wanted?" Mr. Elton was so hot and tired that all this wit seemed thrown away. His civilities to the other ladies must be paid, but his subsequent object was to lament over himself, for the heat he was suffering, and the walk he had had for nothing. "When I got to Donwell," said he, "Knightley could not be found. Very odd, very unaccountable. After the note I sent him this morning, and the message he returned, that he should certainly be at home till 1. "Donwell?" cried his wife. "My dear Mr. E., you have not been to Donwell. You mean the Crown. You come from the meeting at the Crown. No, that's tomorrow. And I particularly wanted to see Knightley today on that very account. Such a dreadful broiling morning. I went over the fields too," speaking in a tone of great ill-usage, which made it so much worse. "And then not to find him at home. I assure you I am not at all pleased, and no apology left, no message for me. The housekeeper declared she knew nothing of my being expected. Very extraordinary. And nobody knew at all which way he was gone. Perhaps to Hartfield, perhaps to the Abbey Mill, perhaps into his woods. Miss Woodhouse, this is not like our friend Knightley. Can you explain it?" Emma amused herself by protesting that it was very extraordinary indeed, and that she had not a syllable to say for him. "I cannot imagine," cried Mrs. Elton, feeling the indignity as a wife ought to do. "I cannot imagine how he would do such a thing by you, of all people in the world. The very last person whom one should expect to be forgotten, my dear Mr. E. He must have left a message for you, I'm sure he must. Not even Knightley could be so very eccentric, and his servants forgot it. Depend on it, that was the case, and very likely to happen with the Donwell servants, who are all, I have often observed, extremely awkward and remiss. I'm sure I would not have such a creature as his Harry stand at our sideboard for any consideration, and as for Mrs. Hodges, Wright holds her very cheap indeed. She promised Wright a receipt, and never sent it. I met William Larkins," continued Mr. Elton, "as I got near the house, and he told me I should not find his master at home, but I did not believe him. William seemed rather out of humour. He said he did not know what was come to his master lately, he said, but he could hardly ever get the speech of him. I have nothing to do with William's wants, but it is really of great importance that I should see Knightley to-day, and it becomes a matter, therefore, of a very serious inconvenience that I should have had this hot walk to no purpose." Emma felt that she could not do better than go home directly. In all probability she was, at this very time, waited for there, and Mr. Knightley might be preserved from sinking deeper in aggression towards Mr. Elton, if not towards William Larkins. She was pleased, on taking leave, to find Miss Fairfax determined to attend her out of the room, to go with her even downstairs. It gave her an opportunity which she immediately made use of to say, "It is as well, perhaps, that I have not had the possibility. Had you not been surrounded by other friends, I might have been tempted to introduce a subject, to ask questions, to speak more openly than might have been strictly correct. I feel that I should certainly have been impertinent." "Oh!" cried Jane, with a blush and a hesitation which Emma thought infinitely more becoming to her than all the elegance of her usual composure. "There would have been no danger. The danger would have been of my wearying you. You could not have gratified me more than by expressing an interest. Indeed, Miss Woodhouse," speaking more collectedly, "with the consciousness which I have of misconduct, very great misconduct, it is particularly consoling to me to know that those of my friends, whose good opinion is most worth preserving, are not disgusted to such a degree as to— I have not time for half that I could wish to say. I long to make apologies, excuses, to urge something for myself. I feel it so very due, but unfortunately, in short, if your compassion does not stand my friend— "Oh, you are too scrupulous, indeed you are," cried Emma warmly, and taking her hand. "You owe me no apologies, and everybody to whom you might be supposed to owe them is so perfectly satisfied, so delighted even. You are very kind, but I know what my manners were to you, so cold and artificial. I had always a part to act. It was a life of deceit. I know that I must have disgusted you. Pray, say no more. I feel that all the apologies should be on my side. Let us forgive each other at once. We must do whatever is to be done quickest, and I think our feelings will lose no time there. I hope you have pleasant accounts from Windsor?" "Very. And the next news, I suppose, will be that we are to lose you, just as I begin to know you." "Oh, as to all that, of course nothing can be thought of yet. I am here, till claimed by Colonel and Mrs. Campbell." "Nothing can actually be settled yet, perhaps," replied Emma, smiling. "But, excuse me, it must be thought of." The smile was returned as Jane answered, "You're very right. It has been thought of, and I will own to you, I'm sure it will be safe, that so far as our living with Mr. Churchill at Enscombe, it is settled. There must be 3 months at least of deep mourning, but when they are over, I imagine there will be nothing more to wait for." Thank you, thank you. That is just what I wanted to be assured of. Oh, if you knew how much I love everything that is decided and open. Goodbye. Goodbye. Chapter 53. Mrs. Weston's friends were all made happy by her safety, and if the satisfaction of her well-doing could be increased to Emma, it was by knowing her to be the mother of a little girl. She had been decided in wishing for a Miss Weston. She could not acknowledge that it was with any view of making a match for her hereafter with either of Isabella's sons, but she was convinced that a daughter would suit both father and mother best. It would be a great comfort to Mr. Weston as he grew older, and even Mr. Weston might be growing older 10 years hence, to have his fireside enlivened by the sports and the nonsense, the freaks and the fancies of a child never banished from home. And Mrs. Weston, no one could doubt that a daughter would be most to her. And it would be quite a pity that any one who is so well knew how to teach should not have their powers in exercise again. She has had the advantage, you know, of practicing on me, she continued, like la Baronne d'Almagne on Le Comtesse d'Ostalis in Madame de Genlis, Adelaide, and Theodore. And we shall now see her own little Adelaide, educated on a more perfect plan. That is, replied Mr. Knightley, she will indulge her even more than she did you, and believe that she does not indulge her at all. It will be the only difference. Poor child, cried Emma. At that rate, what will become of her? Nothing very bad. The fate of thousands. She will be disagreeable in infancy and correct herself as she grows older. I am losing all my bitterness against spoiled children, my dearest Emma. I, who am owing all my happiness to you, would not it be horrible ingratitude in me to be severe on them? Emma laughed and replied, But I had the assistance of all your endeavours to counteract the indulgence of other people. I doubt whether my own sense would have corrected me without it. Do you? I have no doubt. Nature gives you understanding. Miss Taylor gave you principles. You must have done well. My interference was quite as likely to do harm as good. It was very natural for you to say, What right has he to lecture me? And I am afraid, very natural for you to feel that it was done in a disagreeable manner. I do not believe I did you any good. The good was all to myself, and by making you an object of the tenderest affection to me. I could not think about you so much without doting on you, faults and all, and by dint of fancying so many errors, have been in love with you ever since you were 13, at least. I am sure you were of use to me, cried Emma. I was very often influenced rightly by you, oftener than I would own at the time. I'm very sure you did me good. And if poor little Anna Weston is to be spoiled, it will be the greatest humanity in you to do as much for her as you have done for me, except falling in love with her when she is 13. How often, when you were a girl, have you said to me with one of your saucy looks, Mr. Knightley, I am going to do so-and-so. Papa says I may. Or, I have Miss Taylor's leave. Something which you knew I did not approve. In such cases, my interference was giving you 2 bad feelings instead of 1. What an amiable creature I was. No wonder you should hold my speeches in such affectionate remembrance. Mr. Knightley. Mr. Knightley. You always called me Mr. Knightley, and from habit it has not so very formal a sound. And yet it is formal. I want you to call me something else, but I do not know what. I remember once calling you George in one of my amiable fits about 10 years ago. I did it because I thought it would offend you, but as you made no objection, I never did it again. And cannot you call me George now? Impossible. I never can call you anything but Mr. Knightley. I will not promise even to equal the elegant terseness of Mrs. Elton by calling you Mr. K. But I will promise, she added presently, laughing and blushing, I will promise to call you once by your Christian name. I do not say when, but perhaps you can guess where, in the building in which N takes M, for better or worse. Emma grieved that she could not be more openly just to one important service which his better sense would have rendered her, to the advice which would have saved her from the worst of all her womanly follies, her wilful intimacy with Harriet Smith. But it was too tender a subject. She could not enter on it. Harriet was very seldom mentioned between them. This, on his side, might merely proceed from her not being thought of, but Emma was rather inclined to attribute it to delicacy, and a suspicion, from some appearances, that their friendship were declining. She was aware herself that, parting under any other circumstances, they certainly should have corresponded more, and that her intelligence would not have rested, as it now almost wholly did, on Isabella's letters. He might observe that it was so. The pain of being obliged to practice concealment towards him was very little inferior to the pain of having made Harriet unhappy. Isabella sent quite as good an account of her visitor as could be expected. On her first arrival, she had thought her out of spirits, which appeared perfectly natural, as there was a dentist to be consulted. But since that business had been over, she did not appear to find Harriet different from what she had known her before. Isabella, to be sure, was no quick observer. Yet if Harriet had not been equal to playing with the children, it would not have escaped her. Emma's comforts and hopes were most agreeably carried on by Harriet's being to stay longer. Her fortnight was likely to be a month at least. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley were to come down in August, and she was invited to remain till they could bring her back. "John does not even mention your friend," said Mr. Knightley. "Here is his answer, if you like to see it." It was the answer to the communication of his intended marriage. Emma accepted it with a very eager hand, with an impatience all alive to know what he would say about it, and not at all checked by hearing that her friend was unmentioned. "John enters like a brother into my happiness," continued Mr. Knightley, "but he is no complimenter, and though I will know him to have, likewise, a most brotherly affection for you, he is so far from making flourishes that any other young woman might think him rather cool in her praise. But I am not afraid of your seeing what he writes." "He writes like a sensible man," replied Emma, when she had read the letter. "I honour his sincerity. It is very plain that he considers the good fortune of the engagement as all on my side, but that he is not without hope of my growing, in time, as worthy of your affection as you think me already. Had he said anything to bear a different construction, I should not have believed him." "My Emma, he means no such thing. He only means he and I should differ very little in our estimation of the two," interrupted she with a sort of serious smile. "Much less, perhaps, than he is aware of, if we could enter without ceremony or reserve on the subject." "Emma, my dear Emma." "Oh," she cried, with more thorough gaiety, "if you fancy your brother does not do me justice, only wait till my dear father is in the secret, and hear his opinion. Depend upon it, he will be much farther from doing you justice. He will think all the happiness, all the advantage on your side of the question, all the merit on mine. I wish I may sink not into poor Emma with him at once. His tender compassion towards oppressed worth can go no farther." "Oh," he cried, "I wish your father might be half as easily convinced as John will be of our having every right that equal worth can give to be happy together. I am amused by one part of John's letter. Did you notice it? Where he says that my information did not take him wholly by surprise, that he was rather in expectation of hearing something of the kind. If I understand your brother, he only means so far as your having some thoughts of marrying. He had no idea of me. He seems perfectly unprepared for that. Yes, yes, but I'm amused that he should have seen so far into my feelings. What has he been judging by? I'm not conscious of any difference in my spirits or conversation that could prepare him at this time for my marrying any more than at another. But it was so, I suppose. I dare say there was a difference when I was staying with them the other day. I believe I did not play with the children quite so much as usual. I remember one evening the poor boys saying, "Uncle seems always tired now." The time was coming when the news must spread farther, and other persons' reception of it be tried. As soon as Mrs. Weston was sufficiently recovered to admit Mr. Woodhouse's visits, Emma, having it in view that her gentle reasoning should be employed in the cause, resolved first to announce it at home, and then at Randall's. But how to break it to her father at last? She had bound herself to do it. In such an hour of Mr. Knightley's absence, or when it came to the point her heart would have failed her and she must have put it off. But Mr. Knightley was to come at such a time, and follow up the beginning she was to make. She was forced to speak, and to speak cheerfully too. She must not make it a more decided subject of misery to him by a melancholy tone herself. She must not appear to think it a misfortune. With all the spirits she could command, she prepared him, first, for something strange, and then, in a few words, said that if his consent and approbation could be obtained, which she trusted would be attended with no difficulty, since it was a plan to promote the happiness of all, she and Mr. Knightley meant to marry, by which means Hartfield would receive the constant addition of that person's company whom she knew he loved, next to his daughters and Mrs. Weston, best in the world. Poor man! It was at first a considerable shock to him, and he tried earnestly to dissuade her from it. She was reminded more than once of her having always said she would never marry, and assured that it would be a great deal better for her to remain single, and told of poor Isabella and poor Miss Taylor. But it would not do. Emma hung about him affectionately, and smiled, and said it must be so, and that he must not class her with Isabella and Mrs. Weston, whose marriages taking them from Hartfield had, indeed, made a melancholy change. But she was not going from Hartfield. She should be always there. She was introducing no change in their numbers or their comforts but for the better, and she was very sure that he would be a great deal the happier for having Mr. Knightley always at hand, when he were once got used to the idea. Did not he love Mr. Knightley very much? He would not deny that he did, she was sure. Whom did he ever want to consult on business but Mr. Knightley? Who was so useful to him? Who so ready to write his letters? Who so glad to assist him? Who so cheerful, so attentive, so attached to him? Would not he like to have him always on the spot? Yes, that was all very true. Mr. Knightley could not be there too often. He should be glad to see him every day. But they did see him every day, as it was. Why could not they go on as they had done? Mr. Woodhouse could not be soon reconciled, but the worst was overcome. The idea was given. Time and continual repetition must do the rest. To Emma's entreaties and assurances succeeded Mr. Knightley's, whom fond praise of her gave the subject even a kind of welcome, and he was soon used to be talked to by each on every fair occasion. They had all the assistance which Isabella could give by letters of the strongest approbation, and Mrs. Weston was ready, on the first meeting, to consider the subject in the most serviceable light, first as a settled, and secondly as a good one. Well aware of the nearly equal importance of the two recommendations to Mr. Woodhouse's mind, it was agreed upon as what was to be, and everybody by whom he was used to be guided assured him that it would be for his happiness. And having some feelings himself which almost admitted it, he began to think that some time or other, in another year or two, perhaps, it might not be so very bad if the marriage did take place. Mrs. Weston was acting no part, feigning no feelings in all that she said to him in favour of the event. She had been extremely surprised, never more so than when Emma first opened the affair to her, but she saw in it only increase of happiness to all, and had no scruple in urging him to the utmost. She had such a regard for Mr. Knightley as to think he deserved even her dearest Emma, and it was in every respect so proper, suitable, and unexceptionable a connection, and in one respect, one point of the highest importance, so peculiarly eligible, so singularly fortunate, that now it seemed as if Emma could not safely have attached herself to any other creature, and that she had herself been the stupidest of beings of not having thought of it and wished it long ago. How very few of those men in a rank of life to address Emma would have renounced their own home for Hartfield, and who but Mr. Knightley could know and bear with Mr. Woodhouse, so as to make such an arrangement desirable? The difficulty of disposing of poor Mr. Woodhouse had always been felt in her husband's plans and her own for a marriage between Frank and Emma. How to settle the claims of Enscombe and Hartfield had been a continual impediment, less acknowledged by Mr. Weston than by herself, but even he had never been able to finish the subject better than by saying, "Those matters will take care of themselves. The young people will find a way." But here there was nothing to be shifted off in a wild speculation on the future. It was all right, all open, all equal. No sacrifice on any side worth the name. It was a union of the highest promise of felicity in itself, and without one real rational difficulty to oppose or delay it. Mrs. Weston, with her baby on her knee, indulging in such reflections as these, was one of the happiest women in the world. If anything could increase her delight, it was perceiving that the baby would soon have outgrown its first set of caps. The news was universally a surprise wherever it spread, and Mr. Weston had his 5 minutes' share of it. But 5 minutes were enough to familiarize the idea to his quickness of mind. He saw the advantages of the match, and rejoiced in them with all the constancy of his wife. But the wonder of it was very soon nothing, and by the end of an hour he was not far from believing that he had always foreseen it. "It is to be a secret, I conclude," said he. "These matters are always a secret, till it is found out that everybody knows them. Only let me be told when I may speak out. I wonder whether Jane has any suspicion." He went to Highbury the next morning, and satisfied himself on that point. He told her the news. Was not she like a daughter, his eldest daughter? He must tell her, and Miss Bates being present, it passed, of course, to Mrs. Cole, Mrs. Perry, and Mrs. Elton immediately afterwards. It was no more than the principals were prepared for. They had calculated from the time of its being known at Randalls how soon it would be over Highbury, and were thinking of themselves as the evening wonder in many a family circle with great sagacity. In general, it was very well approved match. Some might think him, and others might think her the most in luck. One set might recommend their all removing to Donwell and leaving Hartfield for the John Knightleys, and another might predict disagreements among their servants, but yet, upon the whole, there was no serious objection raised, except in one habitation, the vicarage. There, the surprise was not softened by any satisfaction. Mr. Elton cared little about it compared with his wife. He only hoped the young couple's pride would now be contented, and supposed she had always meant to catch Knightley if she could, and on the point of living at Hartfield could daringly exclaim, "Rather he than I." But Mrs. Elton was very much discomposed indeed. Poor Knightley, poor fellow, sad business for him. She was extremely concerned, for though very eccentric, he had 1,000 good qualities. How could he be so taken in? Did not think him at all in love, not in the least. Poor Knightley! There would be an end of all pleasant intercourse with him. How happy he had been to come and dine with them whenever they asked him, but that would now be all over. Poor fellow! No more exploring parties to Donwell made for her. Oh no, there would be a Mrs. Knightley to throw cold water on everything. Extremely disagreeable. But she was not at all sorry that she had abused the housekeeper the other day. Shocking plan. Living together. It would never do. She knew a family near Maple Grove who had tried it and been obliged to separate before the end of the first quarter. All right, my friends, with that tirade by Mrs. Elton, we will say goodbye for now. For, as I say, we are nearing the end of this story. The next part of this Soft Stories series will be the final one. We will end Jane Austen's Emma after what has been the longest series so far in this channel's history. I thank you for sticking with me through it all, and I hope you have enjoyed. But I should not say such things before we truly reach the end. And so, with that in mind, all I will say is that I will see you soon. But until that time, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.